Hi everyone, I'm Gary and welcome back. And today we are going to talk about travel and how we make travel in our tabletop role-playing games, especially our kind of medieval fantasy role-playing games, how we make that really fun and engaging. So, let's just do a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what travel looks like in the game as standard. So, travel really is an integral part of the fantasy role-playing experience. And that's because it finds its roots in the literature that informs this genre. So obviously in things like Lord of the Rings, in Tolkien's writing, there's a lot of traveling. In fact, that is effectively a kind of a story about taking something somewhere. So it's all about the kind of journey. But even going back to before Tolkien, if you look at like ancient epics, things like the Odyssey, by Homer, which is really about the journey home, right? That's this feeling of nostos and wanting to get back to something. The idea of a kind of a road of trials that we have to overcome. That's really about travel. And even things like the medieval English epic, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Sir Gawain is challenged by the Green Knight and he goes on this journey, and it talks about, in that poem, about how he faces lots of threats as he travels. I think he comes across several ogres, which are kind of a very generic or very typical creature in that, or maybe giants, a very typical creature in that kind of era's fantasy kind of stories. He fights wood wars. All these kinds of things, all these kind of encounters over the course of his journey to meet the Green Knight. And then, it is also worth just stating quickly that travel wasn't originally part of the game. And that's why I think to some extent, there's lots of reasons for this, but to some extent, it's why travel, in terms of its rules, features very minimally in the game, especially in 5e. In D&D 5e, there's pretty much no rules for travel. I mean, you get what? Like, you get the rules about, how far people can travel in a day, but you really don't get anything substantive. Some games do this better. I think The One Ring by Cubicle 7 and more latterly Free League, that has rules for traveling, but as I've just said, that's an integral part of that specific type of fantasy, right? Tolkien-esque kind of fantasy. Traveling wasn't originally in the game. When OD&D comes out, it's about the dungeon. It's about the exploration of an underground kind of dangerous underworld, getting treasure, getting out, selling that treasure, getting more experience points, leveling up and being able to go deeper. And that's the gameplay loop. And it isn't until, a little bit later when we get this idea of being able to leave the dungeon. It's still Gary Gygax and Dave Anderson who had this in the game, but it isn't immediately then. It isn't an immediate concern, is this idea of traveling over land. I mean, in OD&D, Gary Gygax lists the Avalon Hill game Outdoor Survival as an important kind of like, it's a component of playing D&D. A different game to D&D is a component for playing D&D. And what Outdoor Survival actually, what Gygax wanted you to take from Outdoor Survival was this 3-piece kind of hexagonal map. So then you could place things on it and you could talk about kind of like traveling between the dungeon and the town. And that's where the beginning of travel rules come from. Now, what makes good travel rules in a role-playing game? Because we do need to kind of define that and pin that down. Well, the thing is that travel is an abstraction of time and distance. And like most mechanics in a role-playing game, it compresses the time that it would take to do something in real life. And what I mean by that, in really simple terms, is if your party travel for weeks, they can do that while only be sat talking for like 10 minutes in real life. This is pretty much universally true, unless you're playing with something like kind of like slightly strange or different, like one-to-one time. This is generally how travel works in role-playing games. It always takes less time to travel somewhere in the game than it does in real life. And combat, obviously, is like the exact opposite of that. Combat almost always takes longer to play than it does to kind of like, it would take in real life. And there's reasons for those two things being abstracted like that. The thing about travel is that it should create choice. Before, during, and even after a journey, a particular moment of travel or sequence of travel or travel encounters or just travel encounter should create choices. So, before setting off, a party should be given decisions about how many provisions they're going to need. If they're going off into the wilderness, are they going to need enough to get there and get back? Are they going to be able to forage on the way there? This is why I really dislike the backgrounds in 5e, because I think I can't remember which one it is, but I think it's the Outlander background that says, oh, you can, as long as it's like not blighted like death zone wilderness, you'll always be able to find enough food for a party. And it's like, well, okay, you've addressed the issue of travel here by just cutting it out completely, by removing one of those decisions. And it's not bean counting to say, okay, where are you going to get your horses from? How many mules do you want to bring? You do as mules are going to be better in the mountainous terrain. That's what the guy who's selling the horses says to you. They're going to be better in mountainous terrain than in than just on the roads. And seeing as you're going off road, maybe you want to purchase these. How many saddlebags are you going to want? Are you going to have enough food? What about fresh water? There's lots of different kind of considerations that are made before a party set off on a journey. And I think some people might find that a little bit, like I said, bean counting and a little bit too granular. But I actually think it's really enjoyable. I don't want to hand wave those things with my party. And in general, the parties that I run for don't want to hand wave those things either, because they feel like then when things go well because of their planning, well, that's really rewarding. And I'll give them experience points, actually, I would. Not much, but I'll give them some to be like, okay, you planned that really well and that came off as you intended. And for that, your characters should be rewarded. That was an experience worthy of taking something and learning from it. I mean, during travel, obviously, you've got the choice of how do we travel? Like, where do we travel? And the most obvious one is like route setting. Do we go along the main road, which we know is being it's being harassed and kind of plagued by bandits and maybe a group of giants or something like that? Or do we go through the swamp, which is going to take longer, and it's going to definitely contain hazards that we're not aware of? But is the plague on the road of this banditry, is it so bad that we should choose to go somewhere else? That's really interesting. And route setting, I think, is really important. It's also important in science fiction games. If you play something like Traveller and you're looking at astrogation and, which star systems you should jump to, and this is, before and during kind of consideration, are we going to be able to jump to a system where we can access a gas giant to skim gas off it to kind of like purify into more jump fuel? Or are we going to be stranded? Or, does this system have a space station where we're going to be able to take repairs, etc., etc.? So that's, route setting is a really important part, both before and during a travel sequence. And then obviously, the end of a journey, depending on where the player characters are going, because basically they're either going to be going to an adventure location, which in most situations is going to be some kind of dungeon, or they're going to be going to a settlement. And, is this somewhere that we can return from easily? Where should we rest when we arrive? Are we going to have to talk to the guards on the gate and try and, roll some streetwise tests and some gossip tests to find the best inn in town? Is there any inns that we should avoid, for example? There's a really good short story by Robert E. Howard called The Shadows in Zambula. It's one of my favorite ones. It's a Conan short story. And I've talked about the value of reading Conan short stories before. If you click on the top right now, you can see my video on like GM required reading. And in this short story, Conan the Barbarian has arrived in this kind of like southeasterly province called Zambula. This southeasterly city called Zambula. And what he doesn't realize is that the room that he's being rented out by this innkeeper, well, it's actually what's going on is the innkeeper has an agreement with this nearby kind of cannibal cult to sell anyone who stays in this room so he can rob their stuff and these cannibals get fed. And obviously, hijinks ensue. But that's a really interesting thing to kind of consider when you arrive somewhere. Okay, let's roll some tests. And do the player characters trust the information that they've got? So actually travel is doing quite a lot of things. The thing is that I'm talking about travel. I'm not talking about something that's very similar and linked. I'm not talking about exploration. Travel is part of exploration, or maybe exploration is part of travel. And I think that it is worth considering those things as separate for a few moments, in this academic exercise. Travel encounters build drama through unexpected results, such as getting lost, interesting or kind of dangerous weather. There's a great bit in I think it's the 5th Drizzt book, technically the 2nd, because it's kind of like Star Wars, the Drizzt books, where there was like 3 written, like a prequel, like trilogy written before. The 2nd Drizzt book, which I think is Streams of Silver forgive me if I'm wrong, but there's basically a moment where they're walking along this road, the three main characters, in northern Faerun, and they have to take shelter from the fact that there's like heavy hailstones. They're like hailstones the size of golf balls that can be really dangerous, and they have to like hide. That's a really good encounter that I roll out like quite frequently. And obviously there's going to be things like monsters and other NPC creatures that are going to attack the party or interact with the party. And a game master doesn't have to plan these out. In fact, actually, I think that choosing a system for you that allows you to roll with the punches and be procedural with travel, you're going to get more out of it because you're going to have to obsess less over those small things. One encounter that I really enjoyed once was it was a level one, and it was a level one encounter. My players had just created these characters, and they just left this like little village where they were staying. In fact, they were playing my module, The Dirge of the Forlorn Piscator. It was during a playtest of that. And they were stood around like a kind of campfire. They'd set up for the evening during their travel. And I rolled a random encounter for the night, and they got a rock, a kind of giant bird. And I was like, okay, well, how's this going to work? And I rolled for surprise, and the party were surprised. And this rock just swooped down, picked up the party cleric, and just flew off. And he was like, this started a whole sequence where they were like, okay, he got this he was like dropped into this nest with all these baby rocks, and he's able to kind of like batter them as the kind of like the parent flies off again. And the party had to track him down. And that was really fun. And that's another one of those encounters that I just think are really kind of like, I had to interpret what a rock would do in that situation, but it was really rewarding and a really good kind of welcome distraction, a bit of punctuation to the otherwise kind of mundanity of travel. And then obviously travel this goes back to the idea of separating it from exploration, because exploration also does this, or does this adjacently, is they can build a sense of discovery and a sense of wonder. And those two things are different as well. So discovery is the excitement that the players get when they find something that they weren't expecting. Dungeon World does this really well by giving the players the opportunity to decide what they discover if they roll particularly well. But also, this can just be really cool when players find like an abandoned camp and there's maybe a locked chest there or something like that. That can be really kind of like meaningful for players. And another thing to say, of course, is that this idea of wonder. I hear people in the OSR talk about this sense of wonder quite a lot. And I actually think it's very difficult to inspire your players with a sense of awe and grandeur. I think if you are going to be able to do that, it's the same way that it's difficult to kind of actually frighten them if you're playing a horror game. It's not impossible, but it is challenging. And I think my best experience of this is that there's a region in my game world, in my campaign setting that I've had for like 10 years. I'll put a map of it up, and called the Free Cities. And the players have spent a lot of time over the years in the Free Cities. They like it there. It's a little bit like going home for them, going to some of the cities in that place. And there's this enormous mountain range at the top of it called the Cairnosts. And as they come, one thing that I've done to create a sense of wonder before that I have noticed works is when the player characters crest these mountains and see the Free Cities for the first time, both in character for a while, but also maybe even in real life for a while, I can describe the kind of the rolling plains, kind of like, rolling out in front of them, and the distant sea and the middle mountains, and the kind of the early morning sunlight rising into a kind of midnight purple because the sun hasn't fully risen yet. And usually when I do that, and I have to plan those kinds of descriptions to create a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, usually the players do kind of sit back and go, oh yeah, finally, we're getting home now. And you can see it on their faces. And that's a really rewarding thing about travel. So let's look at a couple of ways of doing travel. And just to restate this, remember, it's an abstraction of time and distance. And what we're trying to do, we're trying to make it engaging, basically. We're trying to look at ways that work. So the most obvious way of doing travel in a fantasy role-playing game is the hex crawl. So we talk about dungeon crawls. A hex crawl is exactly what it sounds like. Most of you will be familiar with this, but let's just talk about why we use it. So a hex crawl is where a map is broken up into hexagons. And the party move from hexagon to hexagon, or hex to hex. And they might be able to do, depending on the scale of the map, they may be able, and the terrain being moved from, they might be able to do several hexagons, several hexes a day. And this is really useful because what it does is it allows you to quickly break down an area into a kind of understandable distance. So parties can just count the number of hexes and go, okay, we can do six hexes in a day because each hex is 6 miles and we can walk 24 miles in a day. Okay, we can do that many. And then they start going down there. and they work that out. That can be quite interesting. But also the thing about one thing that I see about hex crawls increasingly, especially in the indie space, things like the Isle of Ix by Skullfungus that I'm thinking of, where you have very densely populated hexes. So classic hex maps, like I don't know, the Isle of Dread, which is a D&D basic adventure, where players are doing that. They're finding things on the map, but they are also just using it as a way of kind of abstracting travel and making it easier to work out how far they can use. That can be really cool. But things like Skullfungus's Isle of Ix, that's where every hexagon is really densely populated, and effectively it becomes compartments of adventure content. And I think sometimes as a game master, you have to do one of those. You want to just use it as a way of organizing travel, and sometimes you want to use it as a way of organizing content, and sometimes you want to use it as a kind of a bit of both. But the hex map comes from outdoor survival. It comes from this really kind of like early way of doing travel, and I think it's a really, really kind of cool way of doing it. Another way of doing travel is the point crawl. Now, point crawls are a much more modern way of doing that, and that is where you do compartmentalize the content. You take the interesting locations on a map, and you boil them down to a series of nodes or points on a map. And then you basically draw lines between each of these locations and the lines represent a number of days or a number of encounters that have to be rolled before they can get to the next point. I find that this is really helpful, especially for very vast areas. Going back to hex crawls for a moment, hex crawls only work if there are cool mechanics to support that, right? That you know that how many hexes they can move before they have to make a random encounter test. And one thing, for example, one hex crawl that I think doesn't work at all is a module that I do actually have quite a lot of affection for, the Tomb of Annihilation, which is a 5e, it's a module, but it's kind of a whole campaign where characters explore a jungle peninsula full of undead and dinosaurs, and kind of both, right? Undead dinosaurs, really cool. But the mechanics in 5e don't support a hex crawl at all, really, because if you look at the rules that are provided in the book and in the DM's guide, I mean, players get all their hit points back after every day. So it's like, okay, we can move this far in a day. We fight a couple of zombies, right? We've lost like 10% of our hit points, and then we're going to rest. And they've got all their hit points back. And they're like, okay, well, I thought we were supposed to be exploring a dangerous, a kind of almost sentient, almost kind of cannibalistic, or at least kind of like hungry environment that's trying to eat you, right? This vast jungle full of disease and man-eating plants and dinosaurs and undead. And the mechanics of your game don't support what you're trying to do here at all, because they don't drain the resources enough, and they neither create risk nor resource management, which are two major parts of any role-playing game, especially fantasy role-playing games. So, one thing I did when I've run that module before, and I might do a review of Tomb of Annihilation, is I've reduced that to a point crawl, because it just means that, okay, I know exactly where all the key locations are. I can key them to a number. I did this when I also ran The Night Below Part 2, which is a gridded map. It's not a hex map, but it basically works like a hex map because it's a gridded map of the Underdark. And actually what I wanted to do was just simplify it for myself, running it as the game master. So I reduced it to a point crawl. You can see my talk through of Part 2 of The Night Below, which is The Perils of the Underdark, if you click in the top right now. But that's something to consider with point crawls. I like the idea of reducing a map to the most interesting things. I've never run Ultraviolet Grasslands, but I also hear that does kind of kaleidoscopic, kind of slightly psychedelic fantasy in a very point crawly way. And it's worth saying as well that every point on the point crawl doesn't have to be interesting. It can just be like, Southern Jungle, but it's just a way of abstracting it and making it easier to manage. And lastly, another way that I'd like to talk about travel is the depth crawl. Now, I have a lot of affection for this mechanic. I would consider it to be a very modern mechanic. And a depth crawl is the most abstract of all of them. So if you had just a map with a scale on it, that would be kind of exactly true. Then you have slightly abstracted into hexes, and then slightly more abstracted into point crawl. And a depth crawl is the most abstract because the distances between the locations on a depth crawl don't really matter, in as much as what matters is it is reduced to just the stuff that the player's going to interact with. So what a depth crawl is where you have a table with a list of locations of varying depth. And basically, players can choose to wait in an area, or they can go deeper, and you would roll a table and add their current depth. So as they go down, that kind of table gets closer and closer to the bottom. I first saw this in the module The Gardens of Yin by Emmy Allen. Again, that was one of the first reviews I did on my channel. I might eventually go back and redo that review. But if you click in the top right, you can see my review of the Stygian Library and The Gardens of Yin, which are really, as far as I'm concerned, perfect examples of point crawls. One really cool thing about a point crawl is that a depth crawl. One really cool thing about a depth crawl that I really like is that it basically could simulate like a card deck. If you had like a card deck of locations, but it's just a table, right? You don't need to make custom cards or anything. And it procedurally generates content for you. So it also procedurally generates that discovery for you. And this is something that I've used in my own games a lot, like lots of different varieties of this. I've talked before about my love of Warhammer Quest. And in Warhammer Quest, which is a cooperative fantasy board game from the 1990s, you lay out a dungeon based on randomly generated cards, but I wanted to add new adventures to that. So I basically wrote adventures as depth crawls, like caves full of goblins and things like that. Even one adventure I even wrote was, for me and my friends, was escaping an inn that's being attacked by beast men. And like the areas on the depth crawl were different rooms upstairs in the inn. They get to the stairway, which is like the deepest possible location. And then they go down the stairs and then you get several more locations. So depth crawls are really cool. I mean, the most obvious way of doing travel that I've not talked about is just the montage, but I really don't like this. Which is just effectively hand waving, kind of saying, okay, you go from here to here and it's just this many rows. Unless they are traveling across a vast area for many, many, many weeks, and there's either you don't want anything to happen, or there's a low chance of something happening, or it's an area in your campaign world that you've just not really given any consideration to, apart from like the end look, like the destination. I would never really kind of montage something. I would always make the players have to kind of work out what they're going to do. And then, that is what we want the party to do. The last thing to say is that what are party considerations for travel, right? Resources, water, food, firewood, maybe even. I ran the Great Dragonlance campaign, and there's a whole sequence in that where they are like in the deep south near a glacier, like the polar south. Near a glacier, and my party were like, okay, do we have enough firewood to kind of get us to where we need to be? That can be really good fun. Do they want to send a character to scout ahead? This is kind of the traditional role of the thief, right? The rogue, to scout ahead like a mile. My party, my most recent session, they were moving a lot of their gold from a bank in a very developed cosmopolitan area into a borderlands region where they were building a castle, because they were going to need the money there to pay all these like masons and everything. And it was going to be like 3-4 wagons of like piles of treasure, because these characters were level 20 of 30 because they were playing my game, Journeyman Expert Master. Really competent, really quite a lot of treasure. And they hired a group of caravan guards, and they had to do a series of kind of negotiations. How much do you want? And they actually got attacked by 90 bandits that tried to rob them. And it was only because, and that was completely random. I hadn't planned for this to happen. And it was only because they'd taken the prudence and the consideration to, why do we hire instead of just like trying to stick all of this on like 2 carts and just getting mules to pull it, and there's just like 4 of us, why do we hire like 30 caravan guards to help us move? And we'll make sure the guy that is in charge, like the caravan master, make sure he's a really loyal, worthy guy. And that was really good fun, and I really enjoyed that. Now, that just about sort of summarizes my perspectives on travel. I mean, I hope you found it interesting. I hope, if anything, it's been really good food for thought. Let me know what you think about travel. Like, does it work in the game generally? What do you do? Because I'm always looking for new mechanics and insights. I really mean that. So please let me know down below if there's anything that you think I missed, or that you would do that you think I should really be doing. But otherwise, I'll put a link below to free copies of my games and modules. But otherwise, I'm Gary, and I'll speak with you again soon. Thank you.